Today's program is in association with the exhibition that we have up on our third floor, dedicated to 9/11, where there are a large number of artifacts from the Twin Towers that are on display, and in effect also a memorial to those members of the University of Pennsylvania who died on that particular day. Today's occasion consists of two particular events. Later this afternoon, Theatre of War will do a dramatic reading of scenes from Joseph Addison's Cato, a Tragedy, and that will be in the Harrison Lecture Theatre. Now we are going to have a lecture by David Brownlee, the Shapiro-Weitzenhoffer Professor in the university here in the Department of History of Art. David, I suspect, is known to many of you. He trained at Harvard, where he got his undergraduate degree actually studying the American skyscraper. And then he went on to work on a number of different themes when he came to Penn at the beginning of the 1980s. Of those many books, he wrote The Law Courts, The Architecture of George Edmund Street. He wrote a guide to the University of Pennsylvania. He wrote, amongst other things, The Architectural Historian in America, a symposium in celebration of the Society of Architectural Historians. A study of Louis Kahn, who of course was associated with this university. The Making of a Modern Classic, a study of the architecture of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And Out of the Ordinary, a study of Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown and Associates, their architecture, urbanism and design. He's therefore extraordinarily well qualified to talk on a theme which I think still engages all of us as we look back to that particular day. The theme, the fall and rise of the World Trade Center. David.
Thank you. Let's make it. Get the stage lights on. Better to do it now. Lovely. I want to begin by thanking my research assistant Natanya Schaumburg, who helped to assemble some of the quotes and some of the materials that you'll be hearing about. Thank you, Natanya. Architecture is at once mankind's most common and straightforward art, and its most complicated. That is because the making of architecture is almost always a collective project made by many hands and the expression of many voices. And because more than any art, because it is the most public art, architecture's voice is heard by many ears and interpreted by many minds. That complication continues even when the architecture does not, when only the meaning of a monument remains and continues to evolve in our memories, in our minds. The World Trade Center, designed by Minoru Yamasaki and built close to the southern tip of Manhattan in 1962-73, is a monument that invites us to consider carefully just how the meaning of a monument is created and by whom. And as we gather today to reflect on the aspirations of those who made these tall buildings and remember the innocence and the heroism of those who died in them, we are still defining them. We are still defining the World Trade Center 50 years after the planning began, 25 years after the architect died, and 10 years after the buildings fell. Which I would suggest to you is how it has always been for every work of art that has ever been created. While art is usually born of the desire of an artist and a client to express an idea, and while it is important for us to search for those originating ideas, long after those artistic words are first spoken, they continue to echo around the community into which they are released, shedding meanings and gathering new ones. It's important to set forth right at the start that the World Trade Center did not begin life or pass through life as a beloved monument whose artistry was admired and whose ambitions were applauded. Wolf von Eckhart spoke for the majority of critics, expert and lay, architectural and social, when he wrote of the rising towers in May 1966, "These incredible giants just stand there, artless and dumb, without any relationship to anything, not even to each other." And Lewis Mumford, associating them with other lamentable traits of American culture in the 1960s, called them a characteristic example of purposelessness, gigantism, and technological exhibitionism. The vast plaza between the towers, lifted up above the street level and connected to the city on only one side, was labeled by von Eckhart this fearful instrument of urbicide. That's urbicide with a U, like urban, and a bland, vast expanse of pavement. Paul Goldberger, a few years later, called it simply a windswept football field. After the official ribbon cutting in 1973, the towers remained the tallest in the world for only another year. They did, of course, find their way into the imagery of New York, but it's notable that in so many of the postcards, especially from the beginning, and in the souvenir models, the World Trade Center is shown with other, more uncomplicatedly beloved monuments, the Statue of Liberty or the Empire State Building. By themselves, the World Trade Center really were what Vincent Scully called them, the tall but inert twin chunks of the World Trade Center. Certainly not as interesting to look at as those older monuments. But it was a real building, not a model, and human life, not human witticism, that was attacked 10 years ago. The North Tower was set afire at 8:46 a.m., followed by the South Tower at 9:03. Struck second, it fell first at 9:59, and the North Tower, having shouldered the fiery burden for nearly 1 3/4 hours, fell at 10:28. Then they were gone. But certainly not forgotten, and accruing to themselves in their last minutes as much attention as they had in the previous 50 years. That is not to say, of course, that all agreed about what they were after they weren't. To be sure, in memory, many now proclaim them to be what they really had not been recognized as before, symbols of American culture, politics, and economics. This could be read positively or negatively, of course, as the terrorists assuredly had. The Washington Post proclaimed, "These landmark structures are symbols of America, a repository of the power of a free people, and thus objects of hate for those who despise the West and everything for which it stands." But John Zeman, a writer in the Bergen, New Jersey Record, offered more nuance. There was a lot of New York boosterism, even arrogance, in the World Trade Center towers. They were powerful symbols of American economic might. All in all, there wasn't much interest, it seems, in fighting and debating over the political meaning of the buildings, which had had really, for Americans, very little political meaning before. The same Bergen Record reporter wrote, "They were visual anchors." I should say much more attention was spent on recollecting their more benign place, their placemaking power. That same Bergen Record reporter wrote, "They were visual anchors, beacons, direction finders, and location fixers. Driving north on the turnpike on a clear day, you might suddenly catch sight of them, bigger and closer than your mind's eye expected them to be. At sunset, they were mirrors to the setting sun, sometimes glowing such a fiery orange that people in office buildings would stop work and go to the windows to gaze." And perhaps most surprising of all, in a way that surely warmed the heart of every art history professor who has ever vainly tried to interest a group of freshmen in the interpretation of abstract art, perhaps most surprisingly of all, the two buildings were now retrospectively accorded some of the artistic respect that they had been denied before. Benjamin Forgey, writing in the Washington Post, now called them those two strangely elegant minimalist boxes. He observed, it made a difference that there were two, that they were identical in shape and sheathing. A single box would have been static, but the two together made a dynamic composition of forms in space. That's someone who took Art History 102. For the rest of the lecture, I want to reflect with you about the way these buildings have been framed, interpreted, and evaluated, both before they fell and afterward, by all those who have had contact with them, their designer and his clients, the community of architects and critics, and the various publics of New York and ourselves. I'll also offer a bit of comparison with two other memorable buildings of the 1960s, I.M. Pei's East Building of the National Gallery in Washington on the right, and Louis Kahn's Assembly Building for the Parliament in Bangladesh in Dhaka on the left. In their stories, I think we can see the same kinds of forces at work, shaping their interpretation and their evaluation. The underlying question for me is, what does it take for a modern building to be admired? Which is something that very few buildings built in our lifetimes have achieved. In 1967, the Roland Barthes wrote an immensely important essay entitled The Death of the Author, which was neither a mystery novelette or a call for the use of euthanasia as an art editorial tool. It was instead an appeal for critics and scholars to shift their attention away from the biographies and the stated intentions of the authors of works of literature and toward the way those works were read and interpreted. I am taking that advice this afternoon, but not before I talk a bit about Minoru Yamasaki, the architect of the World Trade Center, and what he intended. Yamasaki had become a highly visible designer by the early 1960s, as reflected in his appearance on the cover of Time in 1963, when he had just been named the architect of the World Trade Center, and when he was enjoying the publicity associated with his design of the major government pavilions at the Seattle World's Fair, more famous for the Space Needle that you see rising in the distance in the lower slide. Seattle was his original hometown. Those buildings embodied his commitment to turning modern architecture away from austere functionalism to what Yamasaki called an architecture of enjoyment. Rather than evoking the sleek surfaces of machinery, his buildings in the late 50s echoed the structural arches and the decorative traces of historic, in this case, Gothic architecture. His reputation was based on his work as a builder of congenial spaces for work and for study. This included a number of commissions from Wayne State University in Detroit, where his practice was located at this time. This architecture of humanism, that he called it, was characteristically light-filled, slender in its proportions, and decorated with patterns abstracted from historic sources. These traits attracted the attention of his potential clients, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, who aimed to bring the southern tip of Manhattan to life. When Yamasaki landed the World Trade Center job, he was just completing his first skyscraper from Michigan Consolidated Gas in Detroit, which you see here. With closely spaced exterior shafts clad in marble and a ground floor encircled by an airy loggia, Yamasaki avowed in this design that his intention was to evoke history. We hope that this feeling of beautiful upward movement will give the man in the street an experience of aspiration, like the towers of the great Gothic cathedrals did in medieval days. Gothic verticality was also the keynote of the World Trade Center design, which was only ordered by the Port Authority to be the tallest building in the world after he had been at work on it for some time. The narrow windows of the World Trade Center, only 22 inches wide, accented the vertical, and also in their smallness helped to relate the building to ordinary human scale, which Yamasaki had repeatedly emphasized. In his response to the selection committee's initial invitation to him to submit his credentials, he had written, The great scope of your project demands finding a way to relate it to the human being, so that rather than be an overpowering group of buildings, it will be inviting, friendly, and humane. To be symbolic of its great purpose of working together in trade, of the nations of the world, it should have a sense of dignity and pride, and still stand for the humanity and democratic purposes in which we in the United States believe. Gothic-looking arches at the base of the towers also helped to connect the plaza to Yamasaki's acclaimed inspiration, the Piazza San Marco in Venice, a lively space ringed by arcades dating from every era of that urban space's history. At the opening ceremony in 1973, Yamasaki proclaimed, "The World Trade Center is a living symbol of man's dedication to world peace, a representation of man's belief in humanity, his need for individual dignity, his beliefs in the cooperation of men, and through cooperation, his ability to find greatness." But as we have seen, this high-minded rhetoric did not stir the hearts of the critics and fellow architects, who continued throughout the period of construction and after the opening to lambast the unarticulated bulk of the two buildings and belittle Yamasaki's quote-unquote prissy efforts to introduce elements of human scale. The highly influential New York Times critic Ada Louise Huxtable, who had at first been caught up in the lofty ambitions of the project, turned against the buildings as they were finished. The design was at its heart, she said, a contradiction in terms, the daintiest big buildings in the world. These are big buildings, but they are not great architecture, she wrote. The Port Authority has built the ultimate Disneyland fairy tale blockbuster. It is General Motors Gothic. And I confess to you, I don't know exactly what that means, but it's not good. It is from this distance in time easy to see that the World Trade Center was perfectly positioned to provoke criticism from all directions, not just architecture critics. The destructive, quote-unquote, redevelopment of American cities in the 1950s, led by czar-like figures such as Robert Moses in New York and Ed Bacon in Philadelphia, had at last stirred effective opposition. Their leading spokesman was Jane Jacobs, whose Death and Life of Great American Cities, published in 1961, argued compellingly that old cities did not need to be sliced through by highways or converted into superblocks that eradicated the old street plans and buildings, such as the World Trade Center proposed to do. The vitality of old cities came from the mixture of uses and the density of habitation that the new planners sought to undo. In 1969, Jacobs would score, after a decade of struggle, her greatest victory when New York canceled the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which was to drive its 10 lanes across Manhattan Island from the East River to the Hudson, eviscerating Little Italy and what became what we call Soho today. The World Trade Center was easily portrayed as a similar land grab, and indeed one of Yamasaki's first independent commissions had been to build one of the biggest urban renewal superblock projects of the 1950s, the Pruitt-Igoe houses in St. Louis, Missouri, completed in 1955-56, begun in 1950. So thoroughly had the climate of opinion changed on this type of city planning by the 1960s that Yamasaki's Pruitt-Igoe was demolished before the ribbon was cut at his World Trade Center. In St. Louis in 1972, it's safe to say that no one lionized the buildings after they were gone, however. And Yamasaki had indeed abandoned the austere international style aesthetic of those buildings for that special kind of decorated modernism that we talked about, doing that long before the ultimate judgment was passed on these buildings. In this critical atmosphere, the World Trade Center project was highly controversial, and it was subject to the same kind of grassroots protest that ultimately blocked the Lower Manhattan Expressway. However, the small businessmen of Radio Row, which was New York's low-end electronics district, who would ultimately be displaced by the tall towers, they did not prevail in their fight against the project despite a series of lawsuits. Better funded opposition to the project came from competing real estate interests. Lawrence Wien, whose company owned the Empire State Building, organized other landlords as what they called the Committee for a Reasonable Trade Center in 1964. They argued that New York had no shortage of office space, and it was inappropriate for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey to use public money in competition with private interests. Wien's group also predicted that the mountainous buildings would disrupt TV signals. They did, and indeed the television antennas were shifted from the Empire State Building to the World Trade Center as a result of that. And he also predicted that they would be a hazard to airliners, which is, of course, sort of the reverse of what happened. Having failed to block the project entirely, Wien's coalition argued that it should be scaled back. As construction was about to begin in February 1966, The Nation magazine called the World Trade Center Manhattan's Tower of Babel and blasted the Port Authority for its misuse of power. The financial risk that the Port Authority was taking with public money was also pointed out. And the slow lineup of tenants, in fact, led the Port Authority itself and the state of New York to announce that they would move all of their New York offices into the buildings. Then Congressman Ed Koch called for better use of public funds, and New York Magazine took up his campaign in 1970, questioning whether the buildings were needed and whether they could ever be filled. To add to these financial worries was the question of whether the city of New York had given up too much when it agreed to a schedule of payments from the Port Authority in lieu of real estate taxes, which it would have received if they were privately developed. The world was changing as the giant, simple towers were rising. The Arab oil embargo of 73-74 called into question the decision to provide no individual light switches in the huge buildings. And it called into question the wisdom of building such huge buildings in general. E.F. Schumacher's work captured the spirit in terms of political economy. Just as Robert Venturi Koch, and it's really fair to say, created the new architectural spirit, which called for reconnecting architecture with history, reaching down from the pedestal of high art to embrace the ordinary, and celebrating the incomplete and the ambiguous, celebrating complexity and contradiction. Yamasaki's professed humanism and his aluminum Gothic arches took a tiny step in the direction that this tide of history now seemed to be flowing. The World Trade Center was evolved from the ornate, delicately ornamented modernism that he had already developed in response to the same tug on the sleeve that the entire architectural establishment was beginning to experience. Yamasaki was not alone in this somewhat hesitant exploration of a new path. In the late 1950s, Edward Durell Stone and Philip Johnson, like him, recent converts from modernism's orthodoxies, they too hung decorative screens on their buildings and infused their work with classical and medieval illusions. This was indeed up-to-date architecture of the late 1950s and early 1960s in which Yamasaki was participating. Here is the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi. Edward Durell Stone's building is, I think you can see, stands behind what looks like a peripheral colonnade, like a Greek temple, but behind that is a decorative screen, a sunscreen to be sure, but also a great wall of decoration. And Philip Johnson's Knesset Teferet Israel Synagogue in Portchester is a building with a screen wall whose perforations are colored, clearly an allusion to the stained glass of Gothic, and whose interior is vaulted, non-structurally vaulted, in shapes that are meant to look historical as well. Yamasaki's work did participate in this. This handsome office building that he designed for Reynolds Aluminum, standing like the embassy in New Delhi, temple-like on a pedestal, and like the New Delhi embassy by Edward Durell Stone, standing behind a screen, this time one reasonably expected to be, as you might expect, made of Reynolds aluminum, was part of this general wave of activity. But by the early 1960s, this work was beginning to look too tepid to deal with the architectural crisis. The Time cover story on Yamasaki, I showed you the cover before, it included a critique of this kind of architecture, as well as a not so grudging celebration of Yamasaki's achievement. In that Time magazine, Yale's renowned art historian Vincent Scully likened Yamasaki's cage-like metallic screen to a twittering aviary. And fellow architect Gordon Bunshaft of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill opined Yamasaki was an architect, but now he's nothing but a decorator. I.M. Pei, who was just beginning to field his oats, labeled Yamasaki's work mere artistic caprice. Yamasaki's work had not continued to develop in a more identifiably historicist direction, a direction that would ultimately find more favor. That direction was exemplified by the work of Philip Johnson, who in fact was passed over by the selection committee for the World Trade Center. He wasn't thought to have had enough experience. Johnson had already set the trajectory of his architecture in 1961 with the crypto-classicism of his Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth and the Lake Pavilion that he built on the grounds of his own estate in New Canaan. And that pointed him in the direction of the famed AT&T building in New York, the famous Chippendale skyscraper, whose classically pedimented pinnacle was a 1970s rebuke to the 1960s flat-topped World Trade Center. Indeed, Johnson would later build in Detroit his own Gothic skyscraper next to Yamasaki's Michigan Consolidated Gas. You recall that Yamasaki claimed that his building spoke the Gothic language as well, but their contrast highlights the differences between Yamasaki's and Johnson's work. Johnson so skillfully rode the changing tastes of his times while Yamasaki did not. To state the obvious, Yamasaki's Gothic is elusive, contained by the rectangularity of modernism still, while Johnson's is explicit, spikily exaggerated. By the 1980s, a broad swath of public taste had swung so firmly against modernism that it was even safe for high-ranking government employees to venture opinions on the subject. In 1984, Prince Charles lashed out at the rather agile design that had been accepted for the expansion of the National Gallery on Trafalgar Square, branding it a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much-loved and elegant friend. While Wikipedia suggests that he plagiarized that phrase from his then mother-in-law, unconfirmed, the attack struck a responsive chord, and the project was restarted. And the only solace, frankly, that I can find in that rather dreadful affair is that as a result, London got a very good building in a witty kind of classical mannerist style from Philadelphia's Robert Ventura and Denise Scott Brown. With sad irony, while Yamasaki was developing the final design of the World Trade Center between 1962 and 1966, he explicitly rejected the path to greater historical reference and perhaps greater popularity that Philip Johnson would blaze. Although he would be excoriated for doing it, he rejected the suggestion that he give shape to the tops of his towers, so that they might join the colloquy among the older Gothic, Classical, and Art Deco monuments of Lower Manhattan. Indeed, he demanded that the clean tops of his buildings be kept clear of all mechanical equipment, and he even threatened to resign when his clients insisted that the windows of the topmost floors had to be wider than the ones in the rest of the building in order to afford better views to those in the planned restaurant and on the observation level floor. He objected to that suggestion because making the windows at the top wider would accent the top, would make the top look different from the rest of the building and disturbs one's appreciation of the pure and simple prismatic geometry. Indeed, while some other architects marched on toward historical quotation, Yamasaki went the other direction, reducing the amount of quasi-Gothic ornament at the base of the towers, That's the earlier version of the base at the top and the later version at the bottom. He said, you shouldn't put veils around buildings or barrels around them, which in fact was pretty much what he had been doing. And he also redesigned the Plaza so that the huge buildings came directly and dramatically down to the ground. In this, Yamasaki was bucking one trend, but in emphasizing the dialogue between the two simple 110-story prismatic forms, in emphasizing that simple geometry, he was reattaching himself firmly to the great modernist tradition of elemental geometrical composition. That tradition was exemplified by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe's apartments on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago at Wright, which Yamasaki was known to admire greatly. And it was also seen in the stirring homage to Mies, offered recently by I.M. Pei in his first independent job, Philadelphia's Society Hill Towers, in the middle. But I'm sorry to say that having chosen to turn away from the further development of historicist direct decorated modernism and be judged by this other standard, Yamasaki's effort at left falls short, although it's the tallest. That is because whereas Mies, and this is a little art historical analysis for you, that's because whereas Mies at the right pulls his towers close together and overlaps them, that's a Google Earth view of the two Lakeshore Drive apartments by Mies on the right, overlapped and close together. And while Pei, in the middle, maintains the overlap between the north and the south towers, that's the tower at the top and the tower at the bottom, but widens the distance between them and inserts a third tower between them that is not equidistant between them, thereby complicating the conversation in an interesting way. Whereas Mies and Pei do that, Yamasaki simply aligns his towers without overlap to mark the two sides of his plaza. The muteness of this composition is what the critics note. Yamasaki could not match the artistry of existing modernist buildings, nor keep up with those who bucked the historicist tendency and continued to press the capacities of an abstract vocabulary. Somewhat surprisingly, Philip Johnson is also to be counted a leader of the other camp, this abstractionist camp, as amply demonstrated in glass monoliths to just 10 feet. Seen from the streets, or best of all seen from Houston's freeways, that tiny distance pops open and snaps closed, literally animating the dialogue between these two abstract forms. In this, Pennzoil is as potent as contemporary minimalist sculpture, like that of Barnett Newman, whose broken obelisk is on the right. That contemporary sculpture, which rather than abandon abstraction, sought in the 1960s to strengthen and enrich it with complexity and contradiction, a relevant descriptor here as well. As the World Trade Center was nearing completion, the skyline of American cities began to be populated by powerful examples of such minimalist sculpture in architecture. In the Hancock Building on Copley Square in Boston, I.M. Pei deftly unsettled a shiny prism by giving it a parallelogram plan and a slit up its narrow side. Several degrees more provocative was Kevin Roche's UN Plaza Hotel, whose slinky squiggle again merits comparison with the most interesting minimalist sculpture. And in fact, I think it's better. Against that competition, the World Trade Center could not succeed. It possessed neither sufficient historical romance nor sufficient abstract vigor to suit either of the two competing architectural fashions of its day. Poised painfully between the two camps, it pleased neither. It was simply large, and largeness itself was out of fashion. In time, of course, these awkward giants inevitably became a part of the city, simply because they were there every day, inhabited by 30,000 workers, and with concourses beneath them traversed by several times that number of commuters every day who used the PATH system, the PATH station that was right below them. Within a decade of their opening, they were at last built with enough tenants to begin to turn a profit as well. The towers did attract to and please affluent visitors with the fabulous restaurant, Windows on the World, in the North Tower. And the less well-off were drawn to its relatively inexpensive observatory and observation deck atop the South Tower. Their acceptance was abetted, too, by the construction of Battery Park City and the World Financial Center on the vast tract of new land that had been created adjacent to the World Trade Center on the Hudson. This is the first bit of the landfill created by the building of the World Trade Centers that are here going up in that photograph. And Battery Park City and the World Financial Center show in the other slides. Construction began on these projects in 1980, and they attracted real residents and created a real street grid like the one that the World Trade Center had destroyed, which helped to reweave the urban fabric that the Twin Towers had rent and to stitch the Twin Towers into it. Slowly, the big twins began to develop a kind of folklore. The chasm between them was bridged by wirewalker Philip Petit in 1974, and the sheer wall was scaled by climber George Villick in 1977. Even old fables were readjusted. King Kong and Superman moved downtown, notably quitting the Empire State Building. The Twin Towers had earned a right to share the limelight, at least, with New York's older monuments. But notably, more tourists still lined up to see New York from the top of the Empire State Building. By 10 years ago, however, the World Trade Center was at least no longer reviled. The battles about urban planning, architectural taste, and political process of the 1960s and 1970s were long forgotten. Indeed, on March 1st, 2001, in an article entitled "Learning to Love the World Trade Center," Tara Bahrampur reported in the New York Times that the Twin Towers had become the most sent postcard subject, a small triumph. It was thus that they were poised to take the next step in their history towards a kind of an admiration that they had not known before. Now, to calibrate what happened next, I want to talk briefly about two other great monuments of the 1960s and 1970s, which had been highly respected all along. The first is the East Building addition to the National Gallery in Washington, which I.M. Pei began to design in 1966. It is famously a building that derives its form from simple geometry, a trio of interlocking triangles whose relationship is slightly complicated in the manner that I have identified in other buildings inspired by minimalist sculpture during this period. So fascinated is the public by this geometry that they can't keep their hands off it, literally. The stain on the acute angle of the triangle to the right of the entrance is what you see on the right, the stain that visitors have applied to that corner with their fingertips. Visitors pay the same homage to the architect's name, where it is inscribed in the wall of the lobby. And surely the fame of this building is tied up with both its visibly interesting composition and the engaging personality of its designer, one of the figures for whom the term "starchitect" was coined. While the East Building certainly aspires to artistic greatness commensurate with the art that it contains, most of that art is in fact hidden from view in windowless galleries, away from the atrium, which has its shop, restaurant, abundant greenery, and a nearby waterfall. That arrangement clearly what that arrangement clearly evokes is America's most popular modern architecture. An architecture that was created at the fringe of the architectural establishment, but in the very center of the American dream. That popular modernism is the architecture of the enclosed shopping mall of the 1960s. Indeed, I.M. Pei had worked for the first dozen years of his career for William Zeckendorf, the big developer, for whom he designed shopping plazas and hotels. He knew well this kind of architecture, of which we here in Philadelphia have, or at least had, an excellent example nearby, the Cherry Hill Mall. That was the first enclosed mall in the East, built in 1960 to 62. In its atrium, the Cherry Court had a waterfall and trees, and was overlooked by the balcony restaurant of Strawbridge and Clothier's department store. And of course, there was shopping, and there was even a little art. So demonstrably successful was this shopping mall formula for museums, this way of bringing abstraction to life, not just by one star personality, but by the habits of society, that Pei repeated it in Paris, transforming the Louvre, as we know, into something that is rooted in popular experience. Powerful abstract forms also prevail in the architecture that Louis Kahn created for the National Parliament in Dhaka, Bangladesh. That this immensely popular building, the capital of a Muslim state, was the work of an American Jewish architect is almost stupefyingly implausible, especially in the context that brings us here today. But we shall see that its popularity is cradled in several of the conditions that we've already detected and discussed in talking about the National Gallery and the World Trade Center. The first is certainly the personal magnetism of Louis Kahn. For as surely as John F. Kennedy projected an admirable model for American political leadership in the 1960s, so did Kahn's warm artistic personality bathe the world of architecture in the light of American creative freedom. This was especially so in South Asia, where Kahn built in India and Nepal, as well as Bangladesh. Kahn's influence was diminished only somewhat by his death in 1974, and the popularity of the great building has also been sustained by the way that it, set in verdant parkland in the midst of a hugely crowded city, is enmeshed in the life of the population. Especially since the restoration of democracy in 1991, the grounds around the Assembly, and the plazas, and the drives, and the stairs that frame the building are places of resort for ordinary Dhakans on their way to and from work, in a way very much the same that the grounds of the US Capitol, at least before 9/11, were a favored place for homeward-bound residents of Capitol Hill, who would rest there and watch the setting of the sun over the mall. But those connections with ordinary life, as potent as they are, must stand in the shadow of the Assembly's much greater political associations, for its construction was begun when Bangladesh was East Pakistan, and it stood incomplete during the Civil War that ended in 1971 with Bangladeshi independence. After the war, the new nation devised as its flag the orange disk of the tropical sun setting on a verdant field of green. But the gaunt assembly building standing tall on the flat land of that coastal delta, it became its unofficial emblem. Its construction was furthered by every possible means, human and material, which gave the building its distinctive, almost handmade appearance and wove it into the lives of the people. It was thus only natural that this distinctive structure would be repeatedly depicted on currency, stamps, and other official papers. But its image is far more than an official emblem. It is almost ubiquitous in the popular culture of Bangladesh, and it is a particular favorite for the decorating of the pedal and auto rickshaws that pelt through Dhaka streets, including this one, which I photographed from the windscreen of a conventional taxi, having promised my wife I would not ride in a rickshaw. Let's return to the Twin Towers and measure them against these two originally more famous contemporaries. To be sure, their architect, while widely recognized, was not renowned. Nor was the architecture of the World Trade Center acclaimed, balanced uneasily as it was between historic reference and abstraction. There were kind words neither for its evocation of Venetian Gothic, nor for its minimalist geometry. It was not the symbol of great things. Indeed, if it was associated with any public acts at all, it was associated with the arrogance of public officials and the avarice of private interests. All that could be counted to the positive was the way the buildings had gradually been accommodated in the lives of New Yorkers. Two of those things changed dramatically on 9/11. First, the World Trade Center was undoubtedly caught up in the swirl of great events, and from those events it emerged not as villain or victim, but as defender. The North Tower managed to withstand the fire for almost 2 hours, warning the workers in the South Tower to evacuate and allowing, before its own collapse, virtually all of its own occupants, at least those who worked below the crash site, to escape as well. When the World Trade Center fell, it fell as a hero. The second thing that changed was that when the two towers vanished, the second thing that changed is that when the two towers vanished in fact, they left behind a visual memory that was stripped of detail and naturally anchored by their most potent impressors. The two small, not quite Gothic-y details disappeared, and the slack, tepid composition of the two big forms was forgotten, all replaced by recollections of those few moments at sunrise or sunset or seen from the Hackensack Marshes or Liberty Island when the two tall shafts seemed to speak to each other about important things. And so, in its death, the World Trade Center accomplished what it could not do in life. In its way of dying, it became a symbol of American talent and self-sacrifice, just as the Assembly Building in Dhaka, in its endurance, became a symbol of Bangladesh determination. And in the obliteration of all its real detail, it became a work of immeasurably potent abstraction, even more potent than the abstraction of the East Building, for this was an abstraction that you could not touch. It's important to note that a building need not fall to be great. Greatness can be created in architecture from the start. Dhaka and the East Building and Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, shown here, prove that. Although we must acknowledge that the character of that greatness may change or be forgotten as the architecture is observed by subsequent generations. But to start with, we can identify several important constitutive elements that we can look for in great architecture. To be sure, the assembly at Dhaka and the East Building of the National Gallery show that one part of greatness is the ability to penetrate into the imagination and enrich the lives of ordinary people on a daily basis. But that is not enough. For that was what the World Trade Center already had before 9/11. What greatness demands is a message worth hearing and a vocabulary capable of expressing it. That is what Maya Lin created 30 years ago in this black therapeutic wound that she cut into the ground near the Lincoln Memorial. And that is what, by a happy combination of art and instinct, has been created, and that is what, by happy combination of art and instinct, has been created in the immensely moving tribute in light with which the Municipal Art Society has marked the anniversary of 9/11 in recent years. This is a work as powerful as the artistically amplified World Trade Center that we have constructed in our memories. I did not find anything so poignant in the obvious one-armed Statue of Liberty gesture that defined either the first or the second versions of the so-called Freedom Tower project for the rebuilding of the World Trade Center. And after the first and second projects, frankly, I stopped keeping track. And so it's with immense anticipation that I look forward to seeing, I have not seen it yet, the fulfillment of Michael Arad's vision for the 9/11 Memorial, which he has called Reflecting Absence. Developed and by all accounts much improved by his collaboration with landscape architect Peter Walker, his simple idea is to take the two immense pits that are the foundations of the Twin Towers and line their walls with perpetually sheeting water, falling from a parapet that is marked with the names of the victims. That promises to be a work of art that is almost as strong as the World Trade Center that we have constructed in our memories. A work of art that, like all works of art, but more than most of them, is something that we have created in our minds. Because I think that it takes only a moment of reflection on this day of reflection to recognize that the World Trade Center that we now remember is not the World Trade Center that we ever knew. Thank you very much.
Fantastic talk. I'm sure there are questions. I'd like to begin by asking you a question. In a sense, I see where you're coming from, and it's a very powerful thought, and in a way it's there and it's gone. But much of it's the image that remains to us is one that almost benchmarks the end of Manhattan. If you think of how Woody Allen used it,
yes, that's true.
He made Manhattan the whole arc of the city, of which it represented one defining part of the city. And many cities since have taken that same concept. So in a way, it defined Manhattan in the 1970s and 80s and 90s in a form that, for example, the Empire State Building didn't, because it was right at the heart. It was much more like a Roman city. It was right in the very center of the city. I wonder if that has also left its own legacy for us, because it's a city that now hasn't got edges.
Well, I mean, as you point out, and as several other things that I've looked at, and one of the things that I quoted suggests, they were extraordinarily effective landmarks. I mean, you could see them when you're coming into New York on an Amtrak train. It's the first time you could see. And they're powerful, their power in that elemental landmarking way is significant, but I would suggest, at least to me, not much more significant than the milestone on a highway that suggests that you're a mile nearer home. You know, it means you're a mile nearer. I'm nearly to New York, or that's the southern end.
Right.
But what does a milestone mean except location? This is this place. I think I think they're muteness. I mean, Paul Goldberger, who after a couple months after the buildings fell, one of the big photography publishers published a picture book of the World Trade Center. I forgot which book, but he wrote an essay in it, in which he admitted that he had spent his life writing negative things about them, and now he was sort of taken aback. And he said, but in truth, the best he could say was that they were immensely quiet buildings. Well, you know, it's like writing a letter of recommendation for a student who is attentive in class. I was there and was there. I think that's the challenge. I mean, they were gigantic landmarks in the physical sense. There's no getting denying that. And to the extent that we have memories that are anchored geographically, those memories will be anchored to them as well.
Yes. Other questions or thoughts or observations? Please.
I wonder if you could speak to, I mean, this is probably positive in certain ways, but symbolism that they may have had for those who decided to destroy them. I mean, they were mute in, you know.
Yeah, I think quite, you know, I have actually tried to figure that out. And the simplest things that I can say, which I think is probably close to the truth, is the things that we thought were rather disagreeable about them, their size, the fact, I mean, first, you know, by the time they fell, they were not principally the offices of international trade. International trade had moved out, and they were largely occupied by banks and financial interests. And to the extent that the terrorists knew that, that was what they were. But I think that ultimately it was their sheer size that was their attraction they were a representation of the America that was bigger and less graceful, bigger and more arrogant, bigger and not smarter than the rest of the world.
Please.
I grew up in Detroit and happened also to live in New York. And I would take people to those two buildings in Detroit.
Yeah.
They are just beautiful buildings.
Yeah.
But there's something else. I hated going to the World Trade Center when I lived there. I eventually would take friends and say, here you go. I'm going to Trinity Church. Because it's the interior spaces inside made a difference to me. So can you reflect on the interiors of being inside?
Once you got inside, it was better, you mean?
Yeah, on all those three buildings.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Well, I mean, I think, just to go to your first point, Yamasaki was a very skillful practitioner of a style of architecture that had a brief fashionable moment that had some great buildings. I think Edward Goldstone's New Delhi Embassy is spectacularly good. And that there are a variety of other buildings of that kind of decorated, sometimes classical, sometimes Gothic modernism that are very effective. I think Yamasaki is good. He lacked, Philip Johnson had a better eye. And when you see a Philip Johnson composition, things are often more powerful just because he just had more aesthetic talent. But Yamasaki was a very good practitioner of that style. And I really hadn't paid attention to this phenomenon before preparing for this talk. But it is the case that as he was designing the building, he was himself beginning to have doubts about that style and looking for the next thing to do. And he basically was left in the middle as architectural taste diverged in the 1960s. And to stay with it in the 1960s, you should have gone either full-bore historicist or, strip your building of every definable detail, cover the entire outside with reflective glass, and consider them abstract monuments. And I have to say, I like all of those things. I mean, I think they all are interesting, and I do think that Yamasaki was, unfortunately, but what can you say is fortune in such things, left in the middle as that divide occurred, and didn't know which way to go.
Well, ironically, the Renaissance Center in Detroit is the equivalent of the World Trade Center in New York. And that always just sets me thinking of how does it become a monument in itself?
Yeah, no, it's that's itself also a wonderful, complicated story, of course, of architectural painting.
Well, you should present it.
I've worked on it's by the architect that it's John Portman, and I've done John Portman. I'm tired of him. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much.